Well, now to historian Carrie Gibson, our guest. Her book El Norte chronicles the history of Hispanic North America, dating from the arrival of the Spanish in the early 16th century. Her research is not just about the past, but also casts a lens on the present. The Spanish influence in the US states of California, New Mexico and Texas is unmistakable. Other states have Spanish names such as Florida, Nevada, Colorado and Montana. And yet it seems in current discourse that the Spanish are treated as the new arrivals to the country. Such is the Anglo influence on its contemporary history. And Carrie Gibson attempts to answer the question of why this discourse positions US residents from Hispanic countries as recent immigrants, while others, it seems, are simply United States citizens. Historian Carrie Gibson is with us from the UK, where it is very, very late. Carrie, thanks for being with us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It has such a contemporary application, but first talk us through the history and particularly the Spanish settlement of various states of the United States.
Well, it's if you think about it, it's kind of in a couple of waves, really. So what we have is the initial attempts by the early conquistadors, so we're talking 1500s, to settle Florida. So this is where you get Ponce de Leon and the myth of the Fountain of Youth, although he went to Florida twice and he died after his second attempt. You have Juan de Oñate in the west, and he eventually put the settlement in New Mexico. And this sort of continues. And the thing you have to bear in mind is that this becomes part of Spain's attempt to settle what we consider kind of the southern and western bit of the US, which they eventually saw as an extension of what they called Nueva España, which today is Mexico. And after Spain loses its empire in the 1820s, for the most part, you see the emergence of all these, new republics like Colombia, Argentina, Venezuela. And I want to, I guess, draw the point to this is that this is where you start to get the emergence of Hispanic people, of people of Spanish and indigenous origin. And as we get into the 20th century, people from the South at various points move north. And within the US, they are later kind of called either Hispanic and now today Latino, Latinx. And so it's almost kind of a two-wave process. I mean, you have the actual conquistadors from Spain in that early settlement going from the Spanish Empire straight to the US. And then you have this later wider hemispheric, mostly post-colonial kind of movement as well. And there's a lot of that history is conflated, and it's part of the reason of writing the book is to sort of hopefully disentangle it a bit, but also to kind of have this narrative laid out a bit. This is how these things unfolded. This is where the Spanish were, and later where Hispanic immigrants and people from points south came, and then of course there's the zone in the middle, which was part of the US that became part of Mexico that became the U.S. After the Mexican-American War in 1848. So it's this kind of enormous wave of history.
It is, and disentangling the United States from a wider America's history is significant just for just the reasons you say. But let's talk about some of those southern borders now that are so controversial. Could we delve a little into their history? And clarify?
Yeah, of course. Sure. So, I mean, especially thinking about the West, well, one of the things that's often not taught or forgotten, and I'll kind of start west of the Mississippi River, is that after the 7 Years' War, France ceded an enormous swathe of territory that it claimed the United States, called the Louisiana Territory, to Spain, which Spain then administered before giving it back to Napoleon, who told them he wouldn't sell it on or do anything to it. But of course he did and sold it to the United States. So even that kind of aspect of it has been forgotten. But what's interesting about this Western development is that you have Spain in the 1760s, controlling this enormous tract of land that would start in New Orleans and spreads west. They also already have settlements in New Mexico, which started in the late 1600s, and those settlements are quite small. New Mexico remains more indigenous. There's a lot of resistance to these Spanish settlements, and there's an enormous revolt in 1680 called the Pueblo Revolt, when the indigenous people of the region actually drove the Spaniards out and over the Rio Grande, and they eventually made their way back. So there's very much a push-pull to the Spanish settlement of Western North America, and then California comes so much later. For a long time, it wasn't even really surveyed. And what kind of prompts Spain to put settlements there, or try to, was news that fur trappers from Alaska were coming, from Russia, sorry, were kind of going into Alaska and like northern Pacific Northwest territory, and Spain claimed all of that. They didn't have any settlements there. They just sort of said, this is all ours. And then they realized, oh, we should probably start actually, mapping this coastline and putting some missions and some forts in. And that's what they did. And what's really interesting is that is happening in California in the 1770s. And this is around the same time that the 13 British colonies on the Atlantic coast are sort of gearing up for the American Revolution. So one of the things that's very fascinating about this Hispanic history, in what is today the United States, is that it's concurrent. There are two, these are two empires pushing up against each other at the same time. And that is often kind of forgotten. And Spain at this point was an enemy of Britain. So when the American Revolution happened, for instance, the Spanish were able to not only sort of lend material support, but were involved in defending and taking back what they saw was their Florida, which had been ceded to Britain after the 7 Years' War as well. So there's all kinds of geopolitical things going on in this period. And a lot of that, within the way that history is taught in the US, has been kind of sort of put by the wayside. And so, it's not that things move, from one moment to the other. The Spaniards were here and then they left. It was like, no, Spain was extending its empire at the same time that the British colonists were about to start their independence struggle. And I think that's quite important.
What led to the more Anglo-centric focus of history telling, and was religion part of the picture here?
Yes, definitely. So the Spanish Empire had kind of long been tarred with the brush of the Black Legend, which was this discourse that circulated, kind of has its roots in sort of 16th century, 17th century Europe, but it becomes much more pronounced, in the time since then. And it was basically this idea that the Spaniards were particularly, sort of horrible, bloodthirsty conquistadors. And it was and they had the Inquisition, and it was partly fueled by their Catholicism, and they'd build these missions, and they were, such a negative influence on the Americas, whereas it allowed British and Dutch and French to kind of position themselves differently, especially the English and later the British. As after the Protestant Reformation, as not being part of that sort of Catholicism and the violence associated with it, especially that kind of Inquisition politics. So that's kind of a fundamental sort of underpinning. And then as British settlers start occupying the eastern seaboard and bringing with them this type of Protestantism, it becomes, that opposition never really quite dies away. Even though, say, Spain helps these same people win their independence struggle, there's still that kind of remnant of the Black Legend. And as history writing becomes professionalized in the 19th century, well, the hub of history writing are all these Ivy League institutions that were built by British colonists, and a lot of the production that came out of there was very much focused on the narrative of the people who fled Britain for religious reasons, or even some of the other Europeans who came. But the Spaniards were always kind of relegated to a more minor role, and that comes out of this much sort of longer oppositional history between Spain and Britain. And so as that history got developed, it just sort of, the Spanish presence falls into the shadows until the 20th century, when we get to we start to see immigration, and it raises a whole different set of questions.
The impact of each of these waves of settlement, exploration, and then settlement on the Native American peoples. This, it's ironic. You cannot talk about the history of the US and not talk about the impact of each on the Native American peoples. And again, with its forces at play similar and the impact similar.
Well, this is quite complicated in the sense that it's hard. I mean, you can't write about or talk about the history, the Hispanic history of the US, obviously, without talking about the indigenous Native American history. What the Spaniards do, in some ways, is obviously they're the first Europeans to make contact in much of the landscape, between the Calusa people in Florida to the Apache in the West, to the various groups in California, and so by the time the British come, there has already been some European contact. Now, obviously, British settlers don't come and build missions like the Spanish tried to do, and they do this. And there are all these missions in Florida and even parts of coastal Georgia that have disappeared. They were quite rudimentary, but in the 1600s, that was part of this process, was that the religious orders, the Franciscans, usually would come out and attempt to put in churches, but also attempt to get indigenous people to live near the missions, to change how they moved with the seasons, to get them to be more settled, and that was often met with quite fierce resistance. Likewise, issues over land, as the British come and populate the eastern coast, issues over land become obviously very important, and often lead to clashes as well. But the Spanish, were the first, and one of the things I should say as well is that one of the overriding kind of myths or narratives about the US, that goes back to this this thesis from the late 19th century, called the Turner thesis, named after the historian who espoused it, was that that like the formation of American character was brought by the movement west and taking these empty lands. But of course they weren't empty. Not only did they have Native Americans there, they had Spanish mission churches, they had forts. So there's still this idea that like west of the Mississippi especially might have had some Native Americans, but it was like unpopulated. It was there to be settled, and actually that was never the case. And all you have to do is go to California and drive up the Mission Trail, and the evidence is like right there. So there's quite a big disconnect, especially over that period of what is written and what people wanted to believe. And obviously now more recent scholarship is correcting this. There's a load of absolutely fascinating scholarship that I drew from for this book to look at that period. But certainly, the Spaniards opened up that encounter, as they did in South America as well.
You acknowledge the United States as part of an extensive Latin American community. And again, it's hard to turn your eyes from the frictions, particularly around that southern border. Now, everyone looks at the history of Texas. There's just presumptions and assumptions made that aren't borne out by historical fact. So when you talk about the US as part of an extensive Latin American community, what specifically are you referring to?
I mean, well, Texas is a great case in point, right? So, um, uh, the area that was known that today is Texas was obviously part of New Spain, and it was actually not very heavily settled, um, because there was quite a lot of indigenous resistance, and so not many people wanted to move up from other regions of Mexico and populate the border. So, after Mexican independence, the new government there kind of realized that it might be helpful to have any, immigrants or anyone to kind of come populate it. And there had already been something underway while Mexico was fighting its war of independence, involving Moses Austin, and his son Stephen becomes kind of, the person that's considered like the founder of Texas. And Mexico lets people come in, and they also let them bring slaves and enslaved Africans. Slavery had not been outlawed in Mexico yet, but very soon after independence, Mexico kind of wanted to end any use of enslaved people. And this is at the root of why these Anglo settlers from the United States end up breaking away, which they do in 1836. And Texas can't join the U.S. because the people there want to keep their slaves, and so basically this rolls over the next 10 years and becomes the Mexican-American War. Mexico refuses to acknowledge Texas, which has declared itself a republic. There are issues over where the boundaries are, and anyway, it becomes a bit of a war of U.S. aggression. The upshot of it is, in 1848, the U.S. has ceded an enormous tract of land. Not only is Texas, by this point now a state, they get this territory that becomes California, Utah, parts of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. It's 51% of Mexico. So when we talk about the border today, it is not really in the forefront of people's mind that actually there's an enormous swathe of the US that is new, and there are people living there whose families' roots predate today's boundaries, be it Tejanos in Texas, be it Californios in California. There are people who can trace that. So when this talk of who belongs and who doesn't in states like Texas or California or Arizona, it's always kind of shocking to me that how I don't know if it's willful, but how ignorant people can be about this history, which is actually quite recent.
Yes, Carrie, it's a little bit more complex than just building a wall. Where would you put the wall?
Yeah.
Anyway,
yes,
thank
indeed.
you. Thanks very much, Carrie Gibson. Her book is El Norte. It chronicles the history of Hispanic North America.